In this lecture, I'm going to discuss hunger and food insecurity in both international contexts as well as at the national level, and potential ramifications at the local level, going down all the way to individual family level. We'll be considering issues such as social inequality, environmental justice as we move throughout the lecture today. Food security has been defined in a number of different ways, and indeed in much of this class when we've talked about world problems, the idea of phrasing or defining an issue can be very important in terms of how to actually solve it. The World Food Summit in 1996 defined food security, and this definition has been stuck to more or less over the last 20 years or so, as when all people at all times have access to sufficient, safe, nutritious food to maintain a healthy and active life. Now, if we look at this definition, we can definitely parse through it and analyze some of the different components of it. Commonly, the concept of food security is defined as including both physical and economic access to food that meets people's dietary needs as well as their food preferences. And this is from the World Health Organization. So we can think about what foods would actually lead to food security and if those would be the same foods overall. We can think about foods in a number of different dimensions in terms of sufficient food. If we're talking about sufficient food, at the bare minimum, we're talking about macronutrients. We're talking about things like calories. We're talking about things like fat, protein, and carbohydrates, and an appropriate balance to an individual's lifestyle as a whole. And so there's some room for play here in terms of what constitutes sufficient, what constitutes safe, whether we're talking in a biosafety framework, whether we're talking about safety in other senses as a whole. And then the idea of nutrition varies quite a bit in the United States between individuals as well. Some individuals have suggested that mass-produced food, such as ramen noodles, can potentially lead to saving the world. And one of this individual is Koki Ando, who's the CEO and president of Nissin Foods, who are responsible for making large quantities of ramen noodles. And these ramen noodles specifically go and are marketed towards people on the so-called BOP, or bottom of the pyramid. So the question remains, can these things really lead to saving the earth as a whole? So backing up a little bit here, we can think about whether food is in fact or should be a human right. We can also think about not only the definition of food security, but think about this in a broader context. And I like to think in terms of environmental justice. We'll compare conventional and alternative agriculture, critiquing both of these for their relative social justice, environmental, and economic sustainability. We'll look at a couple ethnographic examples, one from Seth Holmes and his work on migrant farmers in the United States, and some of my work in the context of Alaska overall. So what is environmental justice? Robert Bullard, who is known as sort of the founder of the environmental justice movement, came up with this notion when studying the location of dump locations in Texas. And he found that irregardless of the relative class positions, that communities of color were targeted for waste dumps in Texas, in Houston, Texas. And this led to larger discussions about environmental issues and what actually is the environment and how we conceptualize it. And we'll get to this a little bit later on in the semester. But Bullard from 1999 in an interview states that the environmental justice movement has basically redefined what environmentalism is all about. It basically says that the environment is everything, where we live, work, play, go to school, as well as the physical and natural world. And so we can't separate the physical environment from the cultural environment. We have to talk about making sure that justice is integrated throughout all of the stuff we do. So the question comes from here, why have environmental justice? Why is the environmental justice movement important overall? Gultong in 1969 came up with the notion of structural violence. We talked about this a little bit earlier in the semester with Paul Farmer's work in Haiti in terms of access to health care and long-term health and viability of the population. And Goulton defines structural violence as the increased rates of death and disability suffered by those who occupy the bottom rungs of society as contrasted with the relatively lower death rates experienced by those who are above them. So a lot of the environmental justice movement and the calls against environmental racism have particularly been in response to the siting of high waste facilities in close proximity to communities of color, African American, Latino, as well as Native American / American Indian, and Alaska Native populations, as Turner points out in her work in Point Hope, Alaska, with some of the contamination from nuclear testing in the Nevada desert. This asks a larger question about the environment as a whole, about thinking about the environment, about what the environment's all about, and then why individuals are interested in protecting the environment. And we can think about the environment and its multiple impacts on individual health and how this varies depending on individuals' positions within society along the lines of social inequality that we've discussed earlier this semester. So, in terms of the environmental justice movement and discussions overall in terms of food production, there have been multiple discussions about the connections between food security and national security. And here you can see in this slide a picture of Nixon, former President Nixon, and Earl Butz, who is the Department of the Secretary of Agriculture for a long period of time. Butz is noted for his a couple of his statements from planting from fence row to fence row, and to American farmers to get big or get out. And so the United States in the 1930s was really confronted with a choice or a decision about which way agriculture would go. And increasingly, it's been along the lines of commodity production. And it's been tied in with these overall narratives about feeding the world and thinking about food security in the context of feeding not only the citizens in the United States, but also feeding citizens throughout the world, often been called the breadbasket of the world, the breadbasket of America, the Great Plains, the Midwest, where many of the grains, corn and wheat in the United States come from. You can see a quote from former President George Bush as he addresses the future farmers of America on July 27, 2001. He notes that it's important for our nation to grow foodstuffs to feed our people. Can you imagine a country that was unable to grow enough food to feed the people? It would be a nation that would be subject to international pressure. It would be a nation at risk. And so when we're talking about American agriculture, we're really talking about a national security issue. So this idea of that goes back to our earlier discussions about issues of population and overpopulation, that a country fundamentally has to feed itself. When, at any trip through contemporary grocery stores in the United States, one would clearly see that many of the products that Americans consume on a regular basis, in fact, come from a multitude of countries. And so this narrative or this idea of the United States as isolated and just feeding itself is rather much more of a myth. And indeed, in the breadbasket of the United States, places like Iowa, according to a Leopold report, only produce about 10% of the total food that is consumed in Iowa. For Alaska, that number is somewhere between 5 and 10% overall. Continuing on with the national policy discussion of food security and thinking about this in the context of conventional agriculture, former President Bush again notes here, discussing the international development agenda of the United States, sharing millions suffer from hunger and poverty and disease in this world of ours. Many nations lack the capacity to meet the overwhelming needs of their people. Alleviating the sufferers requires bold action from America. It requires America's leadership and requires the actions of developed nations as well. We are a compassionate nation, and I believe we have a special responsibility to help those who are not as blessed. It is the call to share our prosperity with others and to reach out to our brothers and sisters in need. And I've put a video on Bolt that has a more recent discussion from President Obama as he discusses food security in the context of Africa as a whole. So conventional agriculture is relatively recent in terms of its production-oriented, commodity-oriented approach. And it's interesting, the discussion about conventional in relation to so-called alternative agriculture in the United States. And alternative agriculture in the United States is comprised of a number of different institutional settings, including farmers markets, community gardens, school gardens, cooperative markets, crop mobs, which you can see pictured here, where you have individuals that want to learn more about farming and they'll come out to a farm for a work day. Traditional food security in the context of Native American agriculture in the United States, indigenous agriculture globally. Community supported or community shared agriculture, where you have a couple different setups here with farmers either selling shares at the beginning of the year. This would be community supported agriculture, so that everybody essentially bears the risk. And community shared agriculture, you might have some people grow potatoes, some people grow onions, some people grow carrots, and they would essentially share this with one another. There's a tendency for more involvement with community shared than community supported agriculture of the community members as a whole. Urban agriculture, which was utilized fairly extensively in Havana and Cuba during the U.S. embargo of Cuba. And here we can see the real dimensions of food as a weapon to utilize or to put a country under political scrutiny as a whole. As part of that would be utilizing any space that would be potentially available for agriculture, including rooftop gardening. We can also think about potentially labeling as an alternative food movement, rather than this being housed under the production model. You can see this is in terms of distribution and exchange, usually yielding a high market value and noting social difference through the consumption of things like fair trade, organic, or GMO-free products. In terms of production, we see in the United States that the production of our food is the result of many laborers and the organization of labor, and indeed the international division of labor. And some of this occurs not only from importers into the United States, but from the movement of people into the United States to work on farms. And Seth Holmes, who has done extensive work in medical anthropology, as well as in the medical field as well as anthropology, really follows in the footsteps of Paul Farmer in looking at the issues of structural violence. And he conducts a multi-sided approach where he essentially befriends a group of Mexican migrants as they move from San Miguel in Mexico up to the Skagit Valley in Washington to Madera, California. And he also talks about some of the issues in crossing the U.S.-Mexico border as a whole. And this discussion in his ethnography, Fresh Fruit, Broken Bodies, he paints this picture of the U.S.-Mexico border, and he paints this in a very deliberate manner, as many anthropologists do, to sort of situate the study as well as have the reader gain trust in his work overall. So he talks about the 49-hour bus ride and some of the challenges that he faces along the way, such as checkpoints, staging towns, how individuals are hiding their money, how they're distributing goods, how they're potentially assisting themselves. He talks about the 9 Triqui men that are with him, the coyote, who is the one who is essentially smuggling these individuals across the border, or assisting in the movement across the border. A lot of barbed wire fence, hours of hiding out, eventually being caught, charged with alien smuggling and entry without inspection, and then a multitude of individuals rifling through his belongings. And they essentially ask him whether it's worth risking his life for this sort of behavior overall. And indeed, the U.S.-Mexico border is heavily militarized, as well as an incredibly dangerous place to cross overall.